If you plan to buy an electric car in the next 5 years, this video is about you. If your retirement fund owns auto stocks, this video is definitely about you. Here's why. In the last 18 months, China produced more electric vehicles than the United States has manufactured in its entire history. Think about that. Their output in 1.5 years exceeds everything Detroit has ever done in EVs, combined. Most people think the EV race is about better cars. They're wrong. The real winner isn't the company with the smartest software. It's not the brand with the coolest design. It's the country that controls the battery. And right now, one country controls almost everything that makes an EV affordable. Every lithium cell, every cobalt cathode, every graphite anode. If you want to understand these shifts before they hit your wallet, stay with me. And as you listen, drop a comment. Do you think the US is winning the EV race? Because what I'm about to show you will change your answer. Let me start by breaking down the biggest misconception about this entire industry. People think this is Tesla versus BYD. They think it's about design, software, or branding. They look at Elon Musk's latest announcement or compare range numbers and assume that's where the battle is being fought. Walk into any conversation about EVs and you'll hear people debating horsepower, charging speeds, and autopilot features. But here's the truth. EVs aren't tech products. They're industrial products. And in industrial wars, whoever controls inputs controls outcomes. Think about it this way. You can have the best engineers in Silicon Valley. You can have the most innovative designs coming out of California studios. You can have the strongest brand recognition in the world. But if you don't control the raw materials and the manufacturing infrastructure, you're building your empire on rented land. You're one supply disruption away from crisis. You're one policy change away from collapse. And China doesn't rent. They own. Let me give you the numbers that most people never see. China controls the refining of nearly 80% of the world's lithium. They process over 90% of natural graphite. When it comes to cobalt refining, they're responsible for roughly 70%. Now, these aren't just components. These are the fundamental building blocks of every EV battery on the planet. Without lithium, there's no cathode. Without graphite, there's no anode. Without cobalt, there's no energy density. These three materials are non-negotiable. And one country controls the refining of all three. But it gets even more concentrated when you look at battery production itself. More than 60% of all EV batteries manufactured globally come from China. Companies like CATL and BYD aren't just making batteries for Chinese cars. They're supplying BMW. They're supplying Ford. They're supplying Tesla's Shanghai factory. They're supplying everyone. The battery cell production capacity in China dwarfs what exists anywhere else. South Korea has Samsung SDI and LG Energy Solution. Japan has Panasonic. But even combined, they're less than half of China's capacity. It's not even close. And this wasn't built overnight. This is the part most Americans completely miss. China spent more than a decade locking this down. While Western countries were debating climate policy and waiting for market forces to naturally evolve, China was systematically securing mining rights in Africa, South America, and Australia. They weren't buying commodities on spot markets. They were buying the mines themselves. They were signing 20-year supply agreements. They were building refining facilities at scale. They were investing billions in battery chemistry research. They were training engineers by the tens of thousands. Let me put this in perspective. While the US outsourced supply chains in the name of efficiency and cost reduction, China internalized them in the name of strategic control. American companies optimized for quarterly earnings. Chinese companies optimized for decade-long dominance. Wall Street rewarded share buybacks. Beijing rewarded supply chain integration. And we're now living in the world that divergence created. So what does this actually mean for you? Because I know these sound like abstract geopolitical chess moves. These sound like things diplomats argue about in Geneva. But these are decisions that will directly impact your life in ways you might not expect yet. You won't see this on Wall Street first. You'll see it when your EV costs $8,000 more than you expected. You'll see it when the affordable electric sedan you were planning to buy suddenly isn't so affordable anymore. Let me give you a concrete example. Right now, the average EV in America costs around $55,000. The average new car, $48,000. That $7,000 premium exists almost entirely because of the battery. The battery is roughly 30 to 40% of an EV's total cost. And American manufacturers are paying more for batteries than Chinese manufacturers pay. Sometimes 20% more, sometimes 30% more. That cost doesn't disappear. It flows directly to you. Higher monthly payments, fewer options in the mid-price range, slower adoption rates because average families simply can't justify the premium. Think about what happens when a significant portion of the battery supply chain experiences even a modest disruption. Maybe it's a trade dispute between Washington and Beijing. Maybe it's policy changes where China decides to restrict exports of processed lithium. Maybe it's a regional conflict affecting cobalt supplies from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The ripple effects hit American manufacturers immediately. Production slows, prices rise, delivery times extend, and consumers are left holding the bag. This isn't a 2040 problem. This is a mid-decade problem. We're talking about impacts you'll feel within the next 2 to 3 years. The lag time between supply chain decisions and consumer prices is shorter than most people realize. By the time the Wall Street Journal writes the headline, by the time CNBC does the segment, your purchasing power has already been affected. Now let me share something that Jeff Bezos understood better than almost anyone in business. In business, speed is visible. Preparation is invisible. Everyone sees the company that moves fast. Everyone notices the product launch, the Super Bowl ad, the stock price jump. The media covers velocity. Investors reward momentum. But the real winners are the ones who spent years preparing the foundation that nobody was watching, the infrastructure nobody photographed, the partnerships nobody reported on. China didn't rush into EVs. They prepared the foundation. While American automakers were still manufacturing SUVs and questioning whether EVs would ever be profitable, China was already securing lithium deposits in Chile's Atacama Desert. While Silicon Valley was focused on autonomous driving algorithms, Chinese state-owned enterprises were negotiating cobalt mining agreements in Africa. While Wall Street analysts were debating Tesla's valuation, Chinese battery manufacturers were building gigafactories in Jiangsu province that would eventually supply half the world. By the time the market noticed, the game was already decided. The visible moves, the ones everyone talks about, those are just the execution phase. BYD selling cars in Europe? That's execution. CATL announcing a new factory? That's execution. The real competition was won during the invisible preparation phase. And most Western companies weren't even in the arena yet. They were still calculating return on investment. They were still presenting to boards. They were still commissioning feasibility studies. Let me illustrate this with a story. Meet David Chen. He's not a real person, but his situation is happening right now across America. David is the CEO of a promising EV startup based in Austin, Texas. They've raised $150 million. They've got a team of great engineers from Tesla, Rivian, and traditional automakers. They've designed a compelling electric pickup truck. They've got pre-orders. They're ready to scale production. Everything looks perfect on paper. But here's what happens behind the scenes. David needs batteries, lots of them. Each truck needs a 75 kilowatt-hour battery pack. To hit his production targets, he needs to secure supply for 10,000 packs in year one. He has two options. Option one is building his own battery manufacturing from scratch. That requires $2 billion in capital investment and 4 years of development. He doesn't have either. Option two is importing battery cells and assembling them domestically. It's faster. It's cheaper up front. So that's what he chooses. David reaches out to suppliers. He gets quotes. CATL can deliver, but there's a 6-month wait, and the per kilowatt-hour cost is $47. A South Korean supplier quotes $44 but with an 8-month lead time. A planned US factory could do $49, but they won't be operational for another 18 months. David needs batteries now. He signs with the Korean supplier at $44 per kilowatt hour. Now here's what's happening on the other side of the Pacific. BYD is making a comparable electric truck. They're using batteries from their own subsidiary. Their internal cost? $32 per kilowatt hour. That $13 difference doesn't sound like much until you multiply it. 75 kilowatt hours per truck. That's a $975 cost advantage per vehicle. On 10,000 trucks, that's almost $10 million. David has to price his truck at $68,000 to maintain margins. BYD prices their version at $59,000. American consumers see two similar trucks. One is $9,000 cheaper. Which one sells? David's company struggles. He goes back to investors for another funding round. They're skeptical. The unit economics don't work at scale. The company either pivots, gets acquired, or dies. This isn't a story about worse engineering. This is structural disadvantage in the supply chain. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because this structural advantage compounds over time, lower costs enable faster scaling. BYD can afford to price aggressively, capture market share, and still invest billions in R&D. Faster scaling drives more investment in battery technology. More R&D creates better products and more efficient manufacturing processes. Better processes drive costs even lower. Next year, BYD's battery cost drops to $30 per kilowatt hour, then $28, then $26. It's a virtuous cycle, but only if you control the inputs. American and European manufacturers are caught in the opposite spiral. Higher input costs limit their pricing flexibility. They can't undercut competitors without losing money. Limited pricing flexibility slows adoption. Slower adoption means less scale. Less scale means higher per unit costs, because fixed costs get spread across fewer vehicles. They're swimming upstream against an economic current that's working against them every single day. Now let me reveal something that's going to sound controversial, but it's the truth that most mainstream analysis completely misses. China doesn't need to beat American EVs in the US market. Let me say that again because this changes everything. China doesn't need to beat American EVs in America. They don't need Tesla to fail in California. They don't need GM to collapse in Michigan. They just need to make EVs globally so cheap that American companies can't survive on exports or compete in international markets. Think about the global market. The US sells about 15 million vehicles a year. That's significant. But China sells 26 million. Europe sells 15 million. Southeast Asia is another 10 million. South America adds another 5 million. India is emerging with 4 million and growing fast. Africa, the Middle East, the rest of Asia. When you add it all up, the US is maybe 15% of global vehicle sales. It's one market. If Chinese manufacturers can dominate 70% of the world by offering EVs that are 30 or 40% cheaper than Western alternatives, they don't need America. They'll have scale. They'll have profits. They'll have manufacturing efficiency. They'll have R&D budgets that dwarf everyone else. And once they have that global dominance, the pressure on American manufacturers becomes unbearable. Higher costs at home, locked out of major markets abroad, losing engineering talent to better-funded Chinese competitors offering higher salaries. The slow squeeze begins. Not through direct confrontation in Detroit, not through some dramatic bankruptcy filing that makes headlines, but through economic encirclement everywhere else. Death by 1,000 markets. The US isn't losing because it's behind on innovation. American engineers are world-class. The technology coming out of US research labs is genuinely cutting edge. Silicon Valley produces incredible software. Detroit knows manufacturing. The problem isn't capability, it's losing because it's playing the wrong game entirely. America optimized for innovation and branding, while China optimized for control and scale. Innovation matters. Branding matters. But control wins. Let me make this even clearer. Imagine two restaurants competing. One has an amazing Michelin-starred chef. Incredible recipes passed down through generations. Beautiful ambiance, 5-star reviews, lines out the door. The other restaurant? They own the farm where the ingredients come from. They own the supply trucks. They own the distribution network. They control the food supply for the entire region. The first restaurant makes better food. No question. Any food critic will tell you. But the second restaurant controls whether ingredients are even available and at what price. Who do you think wins that competition over 10 years? When there's a drought, who survives? When prices spike, who maintains margins? When expansion opportunities arise, who has the capital and infrastructure? That's the EV industry right now. Western companies are the restaurant with the Michelin star. Chinese manufacturers own the farm. And in a resource-constrained world where lithium, cobalt, and graphite aren't infinite, ownership of inputs trumps excellence in outputs every single time. So what does this mean for policy? What does it mean for your investments? What does it mean for you trying to make informed decisions? It means we need to completely reframe how we think about this transition. The conversation about EVs has been dominated by consumer choice, environmental benefits, technological progress, and charging infrastructure. All of those matter. I'm not dismissing them. But they're secondary to the fundamental question of supply chain control. The Biden administration recognized this. The Inflation Reduction Act included provisions to incentivize domestic battery production. There are billions being invested right now in mining partnerships with Australia and Canada. Refining facilities are being planned in Texas and Nevada. Battery plants are under construction in Georgia, Michigan, and Arizona. Companies like Tesla, GM, and Ford are all building or planning domestic battery capacity. That's real progress. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Even with massive government support, even with tens of billions in subsidies, the US is at least 7 to 10 years behind China in building equivalent capacity. 7 to 10 years. In an industry moving this fast, that's an eternity. By the time American battery production reaches meaningful scale, Chinese manufacturers will have another decade of optimization, cost reduction, and global market penetration under their belts. Catching up isn't impossible. America has done it before. We rebuilt manufacturing during World War II. We won the space race. We dominated semiconductors for decades. It can be done. But it requires a level of sustained investment and strategic focus that democracies historically struggle to maintain across multiple election cycles. It requires bipartisan agreement. It requires patient capital. It requires looking past the next quarter or the next election. And there's another layer most people don't consider. China isn't just ahead in batteries for vehicles. They're ahead in batteries for grid storage, for residential solar systems, for portable electronics, for basically anything that needs energy storage. The EV market is enormous. Global EV sales could hit 30 million units annually by 2030. But energy storage for renewable grid integration is potentially even larger. Think about what happens as wind and solar become bigger parts of the energy mix. Wind doesn't blow constantly. The sun doesn't shine at night. You need batteries to store that energy for when generation doesn't match demand. Massive battery installations at grid scale. Utility-scale storage systems measured in gigawatt hours. Whose batteries do you think will be deployed? Who has the production capacity to deliver hundreds of gigawatt hours of storage annually? Right now, the answer is overwhelmingly Chinese manufacturers. This creates a fascinating strategic dilemma for Western countries. They want to transition away from fossil fuels for climate reasons and energy security. But that transition requires batteries, and batteries are controlled by China, so you're trading one form of energy dependence for another. Oil from Saudi Arabia and Russia becomes batteries from China. The geopolitics don't simplify, they just shift. The vulnerability changes form but doesn't disappear. So what happens when America and Europe fully realize the battery war is already over? Because that realization is coming, it's not a matter of if, but when. And when it arrives in full force, when it becomes conventional wisdom rather than a fringe analysis, the response will define the next phase of global economic competition. We're about to find out, because EVs are just the beginning. Energy storage is next, and that battle is even bigger. The country that controls batteries doesn't just control transportation. They control the backbone of the entire renewable energy transition. Solar panels are useless at night without storage. Wind turbines are useless in calm weather without storage. The whole green energy revolution depends on batteries. And right now, that country has a flag with 5 yellow stars. If you want to see what most people still don't, like this video and stay with the channel. Because while everyone's watching Tesla's stock price and debating whether to buy a Rivian or a Ford Lightning, the real story is playing out in lithium mines in Western Australia, cobalt operations in the Congo, and gigafactories in China's Fujian province. And that story will determine who drives what, at what price, and who profits from the biggest industrial transition of the 21st century.